Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eve Samples, Executive Director at Friends of the Everglades. I'm here with Gil Smart, our Policy Director, and today is the first day of legislative session in Tallahassee, and we're going to spend the next hour or so giving you a preview of what's to come over the next 60 days. It can feel a little shock and awe when the legislature is in session, and we're here to help you understand what environmental bills have been filed, what's flying, and most of all, what it means for your community and the water you care about. So before we dive in, I want to thank our sponsors, the Tierney and Wetzel Foundation. They've provided really meaningful grant support that makes our legislative accountability effective and impactful. And I'm going to show you in a little while a place where you can go on our website, everglades.org, to track bills in real time during session. These live events are part of the legislative accountability work that we do through that grant. We publish a pre-session report every year. We host 3 live events, one pre-session, one mid-session, and one after session to help you make sense of what's happening in Tallahassee, which can feel very far removed from our daily lives and what we care about in our local communities. And we also are here to answer your questions today. So for the first time, as part of these live streams, we are not just streaming on YouTube and Facebook, we're also on Instagram and the platform formerly known as Twitter, X. So if you're on one of those 2 platforms, chime in the comments. We can see your questions, and we'll be happy to answer some of those in the last 15 minutes of this hour together. And you can also ask questions, as usual, on Facebook and YouTube. So Gil, I'm just going to circle back to you and thank you for all the hard work you do to track the bills flying out of the legislature. Actually, 2 minutes ago at noon today was the deadline to file bills ahead of this session. And I know they've been coming at you fast, kind of like drinking from a fire hose. So thanks for all you do. And just a quick little biographical information for folks who don't know Gil. He was a journalist for decades before he stepped into this role at Friends of the Everglades. And he also wears a second hat as executive director of Vote Water. But for the purposes of the next hour, he's with us on behalf of Friends of the Everglades, where he's policy director. So thanks, Gil.
And I would say one correction. It's not drinking from a fire hose. It's like standing beneath Niagara Falls at this point.
Yes. and those little ponchos don't do much when you're under the falls. So.
Indeed.
All right. So I mentioned that we've elevated our legislative accountability work at Friends of the Everglades, and I'm just going to share the website where we collect all of that information so that those of you who are following along can see that. So Allie, I know you're behind the scenes. Allie's our communications director. If you could pull up that image of our website, our legislative accountability hub on our website. If you go to everglades.org, click on the Legislative Accountability tab up top. This is what you're going to see. And on the left there, you see a Bills We're Tracking button. So over the next 60 days, while the Florida legislature is in session, you can click on that button and in real time see what bills have been filed. We'll be adding to that document as we find the information and help you make sense of it. You can also take action. We'll have action alerts throughout the session on good bills and bad bills, and you can sign up to get alerts. So we'll post the latest news and reports as well. And you can see on the right, we also have some key players we track. A lot of good information there, and we're continuing to build on it. Thanks, Allie. So I just want to kind of orient our discussion before Gil dives into what's been filed so far. Actually, right now, Governor DeSantis is in the middle of his State of the State speech in Tallahassee, where there's some nasty weather whipping through, I understand. And so far, I was listening to the first 20, 30 minutes or so. I haven't heard a mention of the environment, but we'll go back and review to see. But we do have a little bit of information about what's on the governor's mind environmentally. And the Senate president is Kathleen Passidomo. The House Speaker is Paul Renner. These are 3 key players to watch this session. In terms of issues to watch, and Gil's going to dive into this, top of mind for us is wetland protections and growth management. Last year, we characterized the legislative session as the session of sprawl because of some really damaging bills that were filed that undermine the ability of local governments to protect and enact responsible limits on growth. Florida is the fastest growing state in the nation. We have very delicate natural resources, and responsible limits on growth that are also fiscally responsible are really important. So last year, unfortunately, the legislature passed and the governor signed some bills that defied that. Notably, Senate Bill 540, which we called Sprawl Bill, undermine the ability of residents to file or to challenge comprehensive plan amendments. So when in your community a big development's planned on, say, ag land, the county has to pass a comp plan amendment. Citizens used to challenge those without huge financial risk. As a result of Senate Bill 540, Sprawl Bill 540, now citizens face really daunting financial risks because they'd be on the hook for developer attorney fees if they lose. So that was really a concern last year. There was another bill last year that passed that makes it easier for businesses to sue local governments if they pass bills, local governments pass bills that affect the business's bottom line. So environmental protections could be impacted there. And then finally, I want to mention a fertilizer issue that was kind of a sneak attack at the end of the last legislative session almost a year ago. And it allocated $250,000 for University of Florida to study the effectiveness of local fertilizer ordinances. So Gil's going to talk a little bit about that study, what we saw from it, because we did just get our eyes on it this week, and what it might mean this session in terms of the legislature's action to preempt local governments on fertilizer ordinances, which are one of the most popular and easy things to do to protect our waterways. Okay, so I want to add one positive note. We did help kill some bad bills last year. There was a really bad one filed by Senator Danny Burgess and Representative Randy Maggard that would have prohibited cities and counties from enacting any water-related legislation, ordinances. So water quality, water quantity, pollution control, wetlands protections, all of that would have been preempted to the state. So you're sensing a theme here. It's preemption, it's undermining environmental protections at the local level. Fortunately, that bill died. Unfortunately, Maggard and Burgess are back again with another bad bill this session that Gil's going to talk about. If you want to know more about Friends of the Everglades legislative priorities, you can go to that part of our website at everglades.org that I pulled up. We have 7 priorities: protecting wetlands, getting serious about toxic algae, fixing our failing BMAPs, which are basically roadmaps to pollution limits and pollution controls, don't ban fertilizer bans, smarter controlled development, stop sugarcane burning, and finally send more clean water south in the River of Grass. That is central to our work at Friends of the Everglades and really critical to Everglades restoration. So 7 priorities, go to everglades.org to read all about them. But for now, I'm going to pass it to Gil to walk us through what he's seen so far in Tallahassee in terms of bills that have been filed that we need to keep an eye on. And you're muted.
You hear me now? Yes. Allie, let me know if you need any help with the slideshow. We're juggling here because, as Eve said, today was the last day for bills, and it has been another avalanche, including one I was just looking at as we were starting out here, which could be the worst one we've seen this year. And there's a lot of competition for that crown. So what I want to talk about is that we've got a number of terrible stuff here in terms of bills. Let me see if I can do. There we go. Okay, legislative session begins today. Kathleen Passidomo, Senate President, she's going to be wielding a lot of authority here. Paul Renner, House Speaker, he's going to be doing the same thing. And another key player, just to mention real quick here, is Senator Ben Albritton, who will succeed Passidomo as the Senate President when her term is up at the end of this year. Albritton is an ag guy. He's an agriculture guy. He's a farmer. And he very much represents that constituency, which is frequently becomes an issue because a lot of what the agricultural community wants here in Florida tends to have an impact on Florida's environment and clean water. So far, we've singled out several bills as particular problems, as particular threats. And this one, if you can see the slide here, priority protect wetlands, that's our number one priority. And as such, this pair of bills, House Bill 527, filed by Representative Randy Maggard, House Bill 664, filed by Senator Danny Burgess, is the worst of the lot. This goes after expanded wetlands buffer zones. And as noted here, it requires any local government that has a buffer zone around wetlands beyond what the state would recommend. It would require that that county or municipality acquire that additional land, either by eminent domain, that's what Maggard's bill says, or by purchasing the land, that's what Burgess's bill says. There's a little bit of a discrepancy in the language between the two bills. It would be almost impossible for local governments to manage. We've spoken with folks, some of our local communities, who in one case said this could cost the county $1 billion to have to acquire this additional land. And so it seems pretty clear that this would wind up being an insurmountable hurdle for virtually any community to have to acquire the land, or if they had to acquire it via eminent domain, to go to court, the time and the effort and the energy associated with that. It's pretty clear this is an attempt to scuttle enhanced local wetlands protections. And as such, it's one of our top priorities this year. We oppose this bill. A lot of other folks in the Florida conservation community do as well. These bills, I don't know if they're going to move this year. Maggard's bill, as Eve mentioned last session, the one that would have effectively eliminated local government ability to regulate waters, didn't go anywhere. We're hoping this bill does the same.
And before you move on from that, Gil,
Sure.
let me just underscore that some counties, for instance, Martin County, where Gil and I are sitting right now, have much more protective buffers required around wetlands than the state minimum. So forcing counties to spend taxpayer money to purchase land or acquire land through eminent domain to make up the difference would effectively negate those additional buffer zones and make wetlands more susceptible. And right now, I mean, from my perspective, Gil, I don't know if you'd characterize it this way. This is kind of public enemy number one, as I see it.
Yeah, I would agree. And I will say that's correct until we get into the text of House Bill 1547, which was just filed today.
There's so much competition.
There's so much competition for this title, exactly. But at this point, yeah, I would characterize this as public enemy number one. It's not the only bill that could have an impact on wetlands. There is this year a big push to expand mitigation banking, which is situations where a mitigation bank allows you to perform environmental restoration and earn credits, which can then be sold to people who are doing projects elsewhere that have an environmental impact. It's a common thing across the country, but Florida is looking to expand it. There are a couple bills here as listed to enhance mitigation credits. House Bill 1073, Senate Bill 1532 would require governments to consider unsolicited proposals from private entities for mitigation bank projects on public land and authorizes government to solicit such proposals. 1646, Senate Bill 1646 is interesting because it requires FDEP and water management districts to authorize the use of mitigation credits within surrounding basins, which is to say that if I've generated a certain number of mitigation credits, here in the St. Lucie Basin, for example, we've done some restoration work that's been successful. Project developers who want to do something in an adjacent basin would be able to use those credits to offset their impacts. They don't have to have credits from that basin. In other words, if we create an impact to the next basin over, we don't necessarily have to solve problems in that basin. As long as we've solved problems over here, as long as we've mitigated impacts over here, it's okay if we don't mitigate them over there. There's a lot of questions about how that would work. We're watching these bills at this point. I want to move on. This would be, at this point, number 2 on our worst bills of the year list. We're moving now to the issue of sprawl. And as I think Eve mentioned, we characterized the 2023 session, the last session, as the session of sprawl. This session could easily be characterized as session of sprawl 2. It came from Tallahassee because the number of pro-sprawl bills this session may actually dwarf the number of ones that came out of last session, and that's no mean feat. This is one of the worst ones. House Bill 789, sponsored by Representative Toby Overdorf. Senate Bill 738, again sponsored by Representative Danny Burgess, entails prevailing parties in a legal challenge against the Department of Environmental Protection or any water management district to recover attorney fees and costs up to $50,000. In other words, this harkens back to the bill that Eve mentioned earlier from last session, that people who are challenging comprehensive plan or comprehensive plan amendments, if they challenged it and lost, they were on the hook for the other side's legal fees. Same deal here. If you challenge FDEP or water management district authorization, doesn't have to be a permit. It can just be an authorization. It's very broad language. We're not sure exactly all of what that entails. But if you file a challenge, certainly permits would fall into that banner. But if you file a challenge and you lose, you could be on the hook for up to $50,000 for the other side's legal fees. There's another aspect of this bill that requires FDEP and water management districts to conduct, quote, holistic reviews of the coastal permitting process to increase efficiency and predictability. And now think about that. At a time when Florida is dealing with the impacts of climate change and sea level rise, bills like this would seek to make it easier to build along the coastline. How smart of an idea is that? Again, at a time when we're seeing rise in sea levels. But the primary motivation for this bill, again, as was the case with Senate Bill 540, as Eve mentioned earlier, seems to be to intimidate citizens and prevent them from filing challenges against environmental orders that they feel are wrong-headed. Again, if you know if you lose, you're gonna have to pay up to $50,000 out of your own pocket. How likely are you to pursue that course of action? Probably not very likely, and that's the impetus for this, I think.
Exactly. This is a really important tool that citizens and advocacy groups like Friends of the Everglades use to challenge irresponsible permitting and to uphold environmental protections. So we asked Representative Overdorf when we met with him what the need was for this bill, and he said there had been some frivolous permit challenges filed. And we've asked for examples of those several times and we've not heard back. So we'll keep you posted if we do, but we just haven't seen that demonstrated need. And by the way, Senator Burgess is one of the sponsors of that bad bill from last year that we mentioned before. So not encouraging to see Representative Overdorf, who has a background in environmental science and is an environmental consultant, teaming up on this.
Agreed. And as far as Representative Overdorf is concerned, it's concerning that someone who represents a community that has seen so many environmental problems should sponsor a bill like this. Burgess seems to have his finger in a lot of rancid pies at this point. So, but unfortunately, that is not the only bad bill when it comes to sprawl. We got this bad bill. This is House Bill 1177, sponsored by Representative Wyman Duggan here. Duggan, by the way, was the sponsor of House Bill 540 last year that penalized people who challenge comp plans and comp plan amendments. Senator Nick DeSeglia is the sponsor of Senate Bill 1110. The primary thing about this bill, titled Land Development, is that it handcuffs local governments when it comes to changes to previously approved developments of regional impacts, or DRIs. DRIs are these humongous developments, like new towns that are being built throughout Florida. And according to these bills, if a developer of a DRI wants to change the infrastructure around, the location of roads or utilities, the size, the scope, they can do so with administrative approval. They don't have to go get local government approval. And there's some other provisions in this bill as well that allows DRI developers a lot of latitude and actually curtails local government authority over DRIs, changes to DRIs, in particular. So again, anything that sort of curtails local government authority, I mean, it's effective preemption is what it is. And that's what this bill would do. So for that reason, we oppose this as well. There's a number of other pro-sprawl bills, and I want to spend a moment here now talking about House Bill 1221, the first one highlighted here, which exempts agricultural enclaves. If it's a zoning designation of an agricultural enclave, it essentially means a land that's being used for agriculture that's largely surrounded by other developed land. It allows such parcels, the owners of such parcels, quite a bit of leeway. It exempts them from zoning and land development regulations that other owners of other parcels would have to observe. But one of the big things about this bill, and I just got a chance to read this thoroughly is that it would redefine urban sprawl. And if I can find my notes here, hold on half a second.
While you're pulling that up,
Yes.
this is a litany of really terrible bills that stand to undermine growth management protections in a state that used to be a leader in growth management.
Indeed.
It bears
Okay.
noting that Florida was a leader in the 1980s, 1990s, and really early 2000s.
Here is the current definition of urban sprawl. Urban sprawl is characterized by low-density, automobile-dependent development with either a single use or multiple uses that are not functionally related, requiring the extension of public facilities and services in an inefficient manner, and failing to provide a clear separation between urban and rural uses. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, but it's pretty good in articulating exactly what urban sprawl is. Here's how the new bill would define. Here's how House Bill 1221 would define it. Urban sprawl means unplanned or uncontrolled development pattern. That's it. What does that mean? Unplanned, uncontrolled. So if you've narrowed or fudged the definition of sprawl, clearly you're allowing, the point of that is to allow additional sprawl. That in and of itself is a reason to be very, very wary of House Bill 1221. There's other aspects to this bill as well. House bill, these four bills listed down here, House Bill 267, 665, Senate Bill 684, 812. They're all related. All of them would require local governments to expedite the process of issuing residential building permits. In other words, they want to make it faster for builders to get their residential building permits and kick out more housing, even as the approval process for the development itself is not complete and is going on. Again, all of this sort of smacks of sort of a concerted effort on the part of the building industry, the development industry, the sprawl industry, as we call it, to just push more product through the pipeline as quickly as possible. Once again, hamstringing local governments, imposing all sorts of new sorts of deadlines on local governments that may or may not have the personnel, the capacity to meet those deadlines. Tilting the bill in favor of the development community, in favor of the building community, just to kick out more product, and curtailing the ability of local government to make sure that product is up to snuff, to regulate that development. That, unfortunately, is going to be the effect of this, we fear. There's just a lot of these bills this year. I want to highlight one bill that just was filed. This is House Bill 1547. And what is interesting about this bill is the title of the bill is Local Government Actions. And essentially, this would characterize supply chain and farm operations as what's called identified sectors, key vital sectors to the U.S. economy and national security and food security. And as such, local government shall seek to minimize or eliminate potential negative impacts of its actions on these identified sectors. And local government may have to write impact reports where a identified sector complains that local government rules and regulations are hindering it. Local government would have to respond with some sort of impact report and justify its actions. This was just filed today. The more I read this, the more I think this basically almost attempts to neuter local government's abilities to regulate development, to regulate agriculture, again, which is a source of a lot of water pollution and such here in Florida. This smacks of an attempt to handcuff local government's attempt to sort of regulate, exercise its regulatory powers almost across the board.
What's that bill number again?
This is House Bill 1547, and it will be added to our legislative list once we're done here. This is bad news, folks. This one's bad news. But unfortunately, it is in line with a lot of the other stuff that we're seeing this year. But lest we think it all doom and gloom, let's talk about some bills that we support. There are some bills out there that we support. Primarily, this is one of the top protecting the Everglades protection area. This is House Bill 723, Senate Bill 1364. This is a reintroduction of a bill that got as far as, I believe, the Senate floor last year before sputtering out opposition from builders. This would require comprehensive plans and plan amendments to land within or near the Everglades protection area, within a 2-mile radius of the Everglades protection area, to follow a state coordinated review process. And where it was determined that the development proposal would have an impact, would harm the Everglades protection area, local governments need to figure out ways to mitigate that impact. And I believe would have, if the impact cannot be mitigated, would ultimately have the authority to scuttle some of these plans. This is in response to a situation that occurred in Miami-Dade County. Was that a couple of years ago? It's been going on for quite some time with development in and near the EPA. And this is a response to that. We absolutely support this bill. We supported it last year. And as I said, it seemed to have a head of steam last year and then ran into opposition from the building community. As we understand it, there are, what is it, 5 plans that would be affected by this that are within 2-mile radius of the EPA. So we would anticipate more opposition to this year.
And let's define the Everglades protection area for folks who don't know. It's an area that includes Everglades National Park, the water conservation areas. So basically, when you're on the border of the developed area in South Florida and you're looking out into a vast expanse, chances are that's the Everglades protection area that you're seeing.
Indeed.
And it's really important to maintain that buffer. So this would require, for projects proposed within 2 miles of that very delicate, fragile area, the kind of review that really all projects should get in Florida,
Exactly.
at the very least in this area.
Exactly. So it's heartening to see that. Some other bills we support, House Bill 165, Senate Bill 338. This is the Safe Waterways Act. This would make FDEP solely responsible for adopting and enforcing rules for bacteriological sampling of beach water and public bathing places, and it would require local governments to immediately notify FDEP of any incident that may affect the quality of beach waters or public bathing places. Signage would be posted. This would be a definite improvement over sort of the piecemeal process and incomplete process that we have now. Senate Bill 298, House Bill 1079, saltwater intrusion vulnerability assessments, authorizes FDEP to provide coastal counties with grants to fund saltwater intrusion vulnerability assessments. Very important, obviously, because of what's going on with sea level rise, as noted previously. And then House Bill 1153, Senate Bill 1304, advanced wastewater treatment, requires FDEP to compile a report on wastewater treatment facilities throughout the state, including those that are in need of upgrades, and then the status of those upgrades. The state of Florida, Governor DeSantis has thrown a bit of money here at upgrading wastewater treatment facilities. This is an attempt to make sure we know which ones are the worst, which ones should be prioritized for this work, and we support that as well. Finally here, and Eve alluded to this earlier, this has been one of the big things that we've been watching for over 6 months now. As noted at the end of last session, a line was stuck in what's called a budget implementing bill authorizing IFAS, the University of Florida, to do a study, $250,000, to conduct a literature review of existing studies on the efficacy of urban fertilizer ordinances with summer blackout periods. That means something like 18 counties, nearly 100 municipalities across the state have such an ordinance, which basically stipulates that you are not to use fertilizer with nitrogen and phosphorus during the summer months. For obvious reasons, the concern is that, the rains wash it off, wash it into your storm system. It makes it into your local waterway, and it can fuel algae blooms and other problems. So the line stuck in the budget bill, which passed, also stipulated that it prohibited local governments that didn't have such an ordinance from adopting one until the study was complete. Well, the study is now complete. It was issued a couple weeks ago. I've read it. And effectively, it says the number one takeaway is that more study is needed. There's not enough definitive evidence to say how effective these ordinances are. What we need is a long-term, at least 5-year study and a broader study of a broader geographical area. Obviously, there are different areas in Florida that, the subtropical region, southern part of the state, northern part of the state. It needs to be a comprehensive study that is going to, bring back some definitive data. And the other point coming out of this is, look, urban fertilizer ordinances, first off, they don't do any harm. And they do contribute to nutrient reduction. It's just that the studies have been able to come to some sort of solid conclusion on to exactly how much. So the idea would be that the broader study would sort of verify that. But the question is, now what? All along, ever since the last session when that line was stuck in the budget bill and this passed, the initial study, we've been sort of walking on eggshells, waiting to see some sort of legislation saying these ordinances don't work and we're going to preempt local government's authority to pass them. Well, that's not the conclusion. The worst case scenario didn't come to pass in this respect. We have this kind of, not much there conclusion from this. So we're waiting to see if there's going to be legislation filed on this. I've seen nothing today. Again, the day is not over. I haven't seen everything that was filed today, but the thought is it is possible. What we fear is that legislators will attempt to continue the preemption, the temporary preemption on new such ordinances until this larger, more comprehensive study is finished. And again, that could take years. That could take like 5 years. So the concern is that there's going to be some sort of legislative proposal to prohibit local governments from adopting these ordinances for that period. Now, again, we haven't seen anything, but the thought is it's possible that will be done the way this initial thing was done. In other words, stuck into some bill, appended to some completely unrelated legislation at some point and passed that way to avoid scrutiny, to avoid debate. So we're keeping an ear close to the ground on this. And again, on our legislative accountability page, we'll post any info we have on it. If there is a bill on this, we'll post it there. If it gets appended or stuck in some other legislation, we'll note that for you there as well.
So basically, the state spent $250,000 on a study that says we need more studies. Mm-hmm. And that may be used as justification for undermining local fertilizer ordinances that limit runoff of phosphorus and nitrogen into our waterways. So we're watching
how we roll in Florida, baby.
Yeah, this is what we're up against during legislative session. And by the way, we should mention that the lobbyist who got this attached to the state budget last year, this $250,000, was Steve Crisafulli, former member of the Florida legislature, who now lobbies for the fertilizer company True Green. So this is how it works. There's a lot of revolving door situations in Tallahassee.
Exactly.
I just want to jump in here and say, for those of you watching, if you have questions, we're going to have some Q&A at the end of our discussion here. So please add those to the chat. We can see those as they come in. All right. You got more for us, Gil?
That would be it.
All right.
Thankfully.
So let's talk.
Mercifully.
Let's talk for a few minutes here. Those are the bills that have been filed so far. Before today, the start of legislative session, the governor released his proposed budget. And the governor's proposed budget, as every year, it will not be the final budget. It's an idea of his priorities. It's a request. I know you've looked at that, Gil, to look at what he's asking for in terms of environmental spending. What are you seeing there?
Well, he's garnered some praise from the conservation community for the amount of money he's allocating for some of these things. He is proposing more than $745 million for Everglades restoration projects. The problem is there's not a lot of detail on exactly where some of that money would be spent. For example, of that $745 million, he's got earmarked $550 million for the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or CERP. Now, this is sort of the broad suite of projects designed to restore the Everglades, but there's a lot of projects in there. There's a lot of expensive projects in there. Which one would get, this amount of money or that amount of money? It's not articulated in his budget request. So we would have to see how that breaks down. That $745 million also includes $64 million for the EA reservoir project, which is designed to cut discharges from the St. Lucie, which is great. But our organization has some significant concerns about whether this reservoir is going to operate as advertised. So, we'll see, I guess, because it's in process now. $50 million for specific project components designed to achieve the greatest reduction in harmful discharges to the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie estuaries as identified in SERP. Okay, so what are those projects? Well, we don't know all of them yet. $81.5 million for NEEP, the Northern Everglades and Estuaries Protection Program. And $3 million to remove pythons, by the way. So,
I saw there was another $10 million, I think, for technologies to address removal.
There is, yeah. So we've got, and this is aside from the Everglades improvements, we've got $330 million for targeted water quality improvement, which includes $135 million for the water quality improvement grant program to expand or upgrade wastewater treatment facilities and septic to sewer conversions. We got $100 million for the Indian River Lagoon Protection Program, which was established in the 2023 budget and funded with $100 million. DeSantis has a commitment to that to $100 million a year, which is great. But again, it's sort of a drop in the bucket as to what the IRL actually needs. There is $50 million to restore Florida Springs, $55 million to improve water quality and combat the impacts of harmful algal blooms, including blue-green algae and red tide, including $10 million for innovative technologies to aid in the prevention, cleanup, and mitigation of harmful algal blooms.
So let me jump in there because you've heard me say this before, Gil. The governor-appointed blue-green algae task force has said for more than a year now, maybe 2 years, hey, we need to know what the unintended consequences are of these technologies we're using to douse algae blooms, especially blue-green algae in the state. And we have yet to see that from the state of Florida. So another 10 million proposed for these innovative technologies, algicides, and not all algae is bad. A lot of it's bad.
Right, exactly. And water officials at the state level have assured us that, it's not doing any harm and, these concerns are unfounded. But again, I think we need to see, some proof of that. A lot of the stuff needs to be vetted to the extent that it's not being vetted now. So,
so as you guys can tell, you who are listening in the audience, the budget numbers can be overwhelming. Those numbers tend to be what show up in headlines because numbers are easy to follow, kind of like the stock market. Up is good, down is bad. But really, if these millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars aren't going towards projects that are effective in the long run, we're not supportive. Friends of the Everglades isn't supportive. So that's the bottom line for us. And we'll be watching how the budget shakes out and tracking that and holding the state responsible for that spending. So I see some questions popping in. We're going to talk about a couple other things and then we'll get to some of them. So Gil, in a minute or two, who do you think is the most important lawmaker or a couple of lawmakers to watch this session? I mean, I know leadership is important. Who else should we be watching?
Leadership, House Speaker Paul Renner and Senate President Kathleen Passidomo in particular. But one guy you really want to keep an eye on is Senator Ben Albritton. He is, when Passidomo's, he's the Senate Majority Leader, Republican Majority Leader. And when Passidomo's tenure is up, Albritton will become Senate President. Albritton is an agriculture guy. He's a farmer, I think, as I mentioned earlier. And his constituency is the agricultural community. And again, he's been behind some bills over the last couple years that we have taken exception to. He was the author of Senate Bill 1000 2 years ago, which allowed for what's called rate tailoring for citrus crops. In other words, basically, you're a citrus farmer, you want to maximize your yield, you bring in some experts to tell you how much fertilizer you need to use, and if it's above and beyond what the state recommends you use, because obviously we're concerned about fertilizer runoff, that sort of thing. Even if it's above and beyond what the state tells you, you should be using, you're allowed to adopt the higher standards. In other words, we fear this is going to contribute to more water pollution. So he was the author of that. He was also the guy behind the notorious Senate Bill 2508 a couple years ago, which was a bill that generated a heck of a lot of hullabaloo here in Florida because, among other things, it would have effectively solidified the sugar industry's iron grip on water management at Lake Okeechobee. He was the guy, and I was at a public hearing, the only public hearing on that bill, which was passed by the legislature, vetoed by Governor DeSantis. And after dozens of fishing guides and other advocates got up and just talked about the impact this could have on them, I remember Albritton sitting back in his chair and saying, well, sometimes you just have to do the right thing. By who?
Right.
So he is one of the most powerful legislators in Tallahassee at this point, poised to become even more influential. And again, he represents a constituency that sometimes wants things that may be good for the industry, but might be bad for water quality in the broad.
Yeah, I mean, it's a balance, right? And Florida has been out of balance in recent years, clearly leaning toward the development industry, the sprawl industry. And not all developers are irresponsible, let me add that. And the same with agriculture, right? But we've seen a really strong, concerning imbalance in recent years toward those industries at the expense of the environment. You mentioned the sugar industry, Gil. So Senate Bill 2508 was backed by the sugar industry, luckily failed after Albritton tried to get it passed a couple years ago. They've been pretty quiet the last couple of sessions, the sugar industry, at least in front of the public. And we're always watching for maneuvers from that industry. One thing for everyone to take note of is that there's a $5 million budget request from Senator Jason Broder to study Lake Okeechobee and to create a suite of potential water level and lake management strategies that might be explored for lake improvements. Okay, maybe that sounds benign if you haven't been paying attention to the lake. But the Army Corps of Engineers just led a multi-year process, very long process, to develop a new LACO management plan that does have some environmental improvements coming and will take effect this year. It's certainly not a panacea. But anyway, we'll be watching that budget request because it does raise some hackles for me.
as well it should. Yeah. Again, the Army Corps has just come up with a new LACO management plan. Why do we need to study a LACO management plan when we're just getting a new one here?
Right. Exactly.
It suggests that there are some and we know there are some stakeholders who are not pleased with the Army's LOSM, Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual plan. Is this an attempt to sort of do an end run around that? We'll see.
Right. So let's stay on the LACO theme with our couple minutes here before we start taking questions. One of the biggest Lake Okeechobee management advocates, at least on behalf of the northern estuaries, especially the St. Lucie estuary, was former governing board member, South Florida Water Management governing board member, Jackie Thurlow-Lippisch. Last year during the legislative session, the Senate failed to reconfirm Jackie to her seat there, and she lost her seat. And Senate President Kathleen Passidomo, who continues to preside over the chamber, publicly stated that she didn't like some of the comments that Jackie Thurlow-Lippisch made during the Senate Bill 2508 debate. So we lost our most vocal advocate for the St. Lucie estuary, certainly, from that governing board. And now it's just an empty seat up there. And I'm wondering if the legislature will take any action. The governor needs to appoint a new member. That person would have to be confirmed eventually. So we're watching for who that is and really hoping that it's another environmental advocate. And then last thing I'll say about LACO is the lake is very high. It's just a touch under 16 feet, which is about 1.25 feet higher than it was than it is during the average for today. So on January 9th of the average year, the lake tends to be around 14.75 feet. Today, it's almost 16 feet. We're in an El Nino, which means we're going to have a wetter than normal winter. The lake will continue to get inflows and may not recede as much as it does during the typical dry season. And that's going to leave us very vulnerable to damaging discharges from the lake to the coast when the rainy season rolls around June 1st. So something to keep an eye on and be aware of. That's really important to the whole system. Okay, so we have some questions, and I think we can start to take a few of those. Allie, if you'd like to queue up the first one. Okay, Cindy asks, would you say that this is a comprehensive blueprint for undermining environmental protections, or is it piecemeal? Additionally, are we seeing any similar types of legislation in other areas of the country? I'm really glad you asked this, Cindy, because I meant to mention early on about wetlands protections that this is a national issue. And that's because in May, the US Supreme Court issued a ruling in the Sackett case that redefines the Clean Water Act protections of wetlands. Basically, if wetlands aren't continuously connected to navigable waters and you can't tell where the wetland ends and the navigable water begins, they are no longer protected under the Clean Water Act. That's really concerning. Now, fortunately, in Florida and many other states, there are protections of wetlands at the state level and other protections, such as national park or other designations. But the fear is that without that backstop of the Clean Water Act, that states may begin to erode their protections. So that's why wetlands are front and center for us. And we're watching that bill that we started out with about the buffer zones. Good question. Anything to add on that, Gil?
No, but I think, we have seen it in other states. It's not just Florida, but that was our fear all along, was that, this Supreme Court decision was going to lead to legislative attempts to weaken wetlands protections, and it's exactly what we've seen.
Yeah. So. North Carolina and Indiana are two states to look at where we've seen some action to water down wetlands protection, so to speak. Right. Okay, we can queue up the next question. Tony asks, any chance there could be a building moratorium in place for the next 2 or 3 years to prevent developers from building? Fair question. Gil, I'll let you take a first stab at that.
Tony, I would say the exact opposite is happening right now on the basis of all these bills being filed. And certainly you've noticed, building going on in your neck of the woods at a time when it, given the growing intensity of hurricanes, the challenges posed by saltwater intrusion, by sea level rise in general, the impact of development on wildlife, Florida is going the exact opposite direction of what you suggest. Florida, we have 4 separate bills designed to help residential home builders get their permits more quickly, because apparently, the process by which they get it now is too arduous. It puts too much of a burden upon them, and we're not building homes fast enough here in Florida. So we have to do it quicker. And to do that, we have to make sure local government, has to expedite this and kick it out as quickly as possible. And, which necessarily leads to less scrutiny. It's just, we are reckless development. We are dismantling the smart growth tenets that sort of govern growth here in Florida for quite some time. This isn't the beginning of that dismantling. It's been going on for years, started in earnest under former Governor Rick Scott. But we just see, them taking piece by piece out of this wall, brick by brick. It's all coming down. And, again, this year we've got several bills that grant all sorts of leeway to developers, again, of a development of regional impact, DRI, certain circumstances where you don't have to get local government approval to make your changes. That's an administrative approval is required. This new bill I mentioned earlier that was just filed today, this 1547, I need to scrutinize this a little further. But again, this looks like any sorts of impacts on your business. Let's say I open up an oil change shop in town and I'm dumping the oil down the sewer. From the way I read this bill, and again, this is an incomplete reading of it, if I complained it was that enforcing environmental laws was impacting my bottom line, local government would have to fall over itself to justify what they're doing. This is the atmosphere that we are creating in Florida, unfortunately. Okay. And so when it comes to, reckless growth and development, things do seem to be getting worse. And there's a lot of bills in the legislature this session that if they are passed, it will make the situation
Yeah.
worse. So.
I'll just add, the way it's supposed to work is every county has a comprehensive growth management plan. And that plan has land use designations, urban areas, non-urban areas. When the urban areas get full, then you're supposed to consider expanding the urban areas. But we're seeing a lot of leapfrogging over that process, successful attempts to develop in rural areas without demonstrating that the urban area is truly full. It's happening not in an organized fashion. So really the opposite of development moratorium, Tony. I'll add one more thing. I did just see a WLRN story out of the Keys questioning whether there should be a halt on building permits down there because of hurricane evacuation concerns. So there are discussions happening.
Let me throw one other thing out here. This is, I forgot to mention this earlier, House Bill 1221. This is the one that redefines urban sprawl. Also has this lovely piece about infill development. Infill development is like empty lots, like in the middle of, a developed area. Okay. Infill development, an application for infill development shall be administratively approved and no comprehensive plan amendment, rezoning, or variance shall be required if it has the same or less gross density as the existing development and is generally consistent with development standards, including size, blah, blah, blah. Get what this means. If I'm going to do an infill development, I don't have to get local government approval. It's deemed approved, basically. So we've got these situations where we're cutting these developers some breaks. If you want to do this kind of development, you don't need local government approval. It just needs administrative approval.
Yeah, that's really scary.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that means there would be no public hearings.
Right.
Citizen involvement would be limited. It might not even be known that these things are getting approved if you aren't mining the filings at your local county building or city hall. So really scary stuff that we will be working to defeat.
Indeed.
By the way, we'll be sending action alerts. I mentioned this at the outset. Please don't assume that any of these bad bills will pass. We're going to be working for the next 60 days and beyond because there's a veto period after that to make sure they don't.
And in a lot of cases, the only thing that will prevent them from passing is from folks such as yourself who are watching this, speaking up. Your voice does carry a lot of weight in Tallahassee. So
yes. All right, we can take the next question. Okay, Savannah asks, could you further explain the questionable science behind the proposed EAA reservoir? Yes, this is a really important question. So I've got to talk about the background of the project in order to answer it. So in 2013, 2016, 2018, there were massive blue-green algae blooms in the St. Lucie estuary, which connects artificially to Lake Okeechobee, and in the Caloosahatchee estuary. Both of these estuaries got damaging hundreds of billions of gallons of discharges from Lake Okeechobee, which is filled with polluted water. And in some cases, we saw those algae blooms transmit from the lake to the estuaries. After those terrible years on the water, the Florida legislature, and at the time, Joe Negron was Senate president, expedited a project known as the EAA Reservoir, the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir, south of Lake O. This project has been talked about for years, going back to 2000 when Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan was authorized and signed by Bill Clinton. And then it was originally envisioned as 60,000 acres south of the lake. That's a lot of land, but keep in mind the EAA is something like 700,000 acres, and there's about 500,000 acres of sugar south of the lake. So there's also a lot of land at play there. So through the sausage making process in the Florida legislature, that 60,000 acre project envisioned was shrunken down to about 16,500 acres. So how do you hold as much water on a smaller piece of land? You design a reservoir with very high embankment walls. So the EAA reservoir is going to have 37-foot high embankment walls. That's higher than the Herbert Hoover Dike around Lake Okeechobee. And scientists, including Dr. Bill Mitch and others, have articulated concerns about the lack of cleansing marshes, man-made marshes known as stormwater treatment areas attached to that. Because Everglades restoration is dependent on clean water. We take dirty water from the lake into the reservoir. You've got to clean it before you move it south to the southern Everglades, which needs it. So the project was authorized nonetheless in this shrunken down form, and the state of Florida will have to, per the Army Corps of Engineers, meet water quality standards mandated by federal court on water moving from the reservoir to the Everglades. And the National Academy of Sciences has raised questions about whether the existing stormwater treatment areas, those man-made cleansing marshes, can do that. So we're tracking this very closely. This is really at the heart of what Friends of the Everglades does. We were involved in Clean Water Act litigation years ago related to making sure phosphorus standards are upheld and water is clean enough moving to the Everglades. And it's just not clear yet that the EAA reservoir in its current form will achieve that. And it's very likely that more land will be needed. So a long-winded answer, it's complicated. It's about 2 decades worth of history on the project, but we'll be watching it. Okay, we can take the next question. Diane asks, actually has a comment. She says, the St. John's Water Management District did a study on fertilizers and compared 2 communities along waterways, one using fertilizer and the other not. It already proved that not fertilizing made a difference. That is valuable information, not surprising. Anything to add there, Gil? Oh, you're muted.
I'm sorry. The report from IFAS did say that fertilizer bans seem to have some effectiveness in terms of keeping, phosphorus and maybe to a lesser extent nitrogen out of waterways. It's not that the report said that there was no effect. It's that they were saying, first off, a lot of what the report got into was talking about how, other things such as septic to sewer conversions may have a bigger effect. But again, bottom line is there's not enough research out there to justify saying this is our conclusion one way or the other. There's not enough to conclude, not enough research to conclude anything. So I think, a larger study would not be a bad idea at all. You know what I mean? We need to have some sort of definitive idea of exactly what's going on. So it's not that, we oppose any sort of larger study or anything like that. But I think the danger here, again, is the legislature or legislators justifying some sort of ban on fertilizer bans until we know, the results of a larger study, which, as I said, could take 5 years, maybe even longer. This, as Eve said earlier, urban fertilizer ordinances are literally the lowest hanging fruit. They're literally the least any local community can do to try and keep some nutrients out of the water. Yes, they tend to not be enforced real strictly, if at all. So it becomes almost like a voluntary thing. However, any nutrients you're keeping out of the water are nutrients you are preventing from fueling harmful algal blooms, causing other sort of problems. So, every little bit helps. And again, the study did not find any harm from these urban fertilizer ordinances. Quite the opposite. So I think we can be fairly confident that any larger study is going to show, yeah, it does have an effect. Now, then you can get into a debate as to what has greater effect, but I don't think it's a matter of either or. I think it's a matter of everything that we can do to keep nutrients out of the water.
Yeah, and it's just so cost effective. It's a very efficient, cost effective way to control nutrients. We just talked about the EAA reservoir. That's a $4 billion project. And yes, Lake Okeechobee discharges are the single largest source of polluted water when we get massive discharges to the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee estuaries. And storage and treatment south of the lake are needed. And that's why we're so committed to making sure we get it right. I should have mentioned, too, that the land that was not acquired as part of the EAA reservoir is largely sugarcane land. So we don't have willing sellers from the 2 big sugarcane companies south of the lake, Florida Crystals and U.S. Sugar. So it's important for us to understand what powerful political players they are in the state and to be watching them.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have about a minute and a half left. And I'm just going to wrap up by reminding folks that you can go to everglades.org and go to our legislative accountability tab to keep up to date on session as it progresses. And also mention that in February, we'll come back and do a mid-session discussion. Gil and we may invite a guest or 2 to join us. to keep you posted on these bills and others that are filed. And then we'll do the same at the end of session. Gil, I know you'll be going up there. Anything you'd like to add in our last minute?
No, we will be in Tallahassee, as Eve just mentioned. Both she and I are going to be up there this session talking to legislators, hopefully testifying either on behalf or against some of these measures. We're going to be watching it closely. So our list of bills is going to be updated consistently and constantly with the latest info as hearings are held. There's a hearing tomorrow, a committee hearing on Senate Bill 738, which is the one that would saddle opponents of FDEP and water management districts, people who file challenges against them, and saddle them with legal fees if they lose. That's the first step in a long but very important process. There's a lot of folks out there who are already mobilizing against this stuff. And so, as noted previously, folks watching this, you will have an opportunity to make your voice heard on some of these key bills. We will make it easy for you to chime in, and please do so. Because, as I said, your opinion, your comments can really make a difference.
Thanks, everybody. That's a wrap. Take care.